Okay, cool. Thank you. This year's symposium is themed New Frontiers, where the symposium itself will explore through 4 panels frontiers of competition and or cooperation that have newly emerged or re-emerged in recent years in Sino-US relations and how that impacts the rest of the world. These topics include global environmental policy, maritime security, human rights, and global economic statecraft in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative. We hope that through this symposium, we will create crossroads for ideas, experiences, and people that characterize Tufts to promote an atmosphere of deep analysis and critical awareness. We will be kicking off this year's symposium with the David Rawson Memorial Lecture. The David Rawson Memorial Lecture honors the life of David Rawson, a member of the class of 2007, whose life was tragically cut short in the summer after his graduation. David graduated cum laude with a degree in international relations. He participated in many programs in the IGL and studied abroad in Hong Kong during the spring semester of his junior year. David was also a talented tenor with the Tufts Chamber Singers for 4 years, acted in drama performances, and wrote for Tufts campus student publications. He was in the process of applying to the U.S. Naval Officer Candidate School and aspired to become a naval intelligence officer. Beyond these considerable achievements, David possessed a warmth, integrity, and selflessness that made him truly a beloved member of the Tufts community. He embodied the leadership qualities that allies, through which this symposium was originally organized, seeks to promote: a commitment to public service and a desire to embrace complex questions of international relations. We remember him with the creation of an annual lecture series in his honor. This year's David Rawson Memorial Lecturer is Dr. Michael Swaine. Dr. Swaine is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and one of the most prominent American analysts in Chinese security studies. Formerly a senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation, Dr. Swaine is a specialist in Chinese defense and foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and East Asian IR. He has authored and edited more than a dozen books, monographs, and many journal articles, and also advises the U.S. government on Asian security issues. Dr. Swaine today will be speaking on the topic of power transitions and paranoia, the crisis in Sino-U.S. security relations. Without further ado, Dr. Swaine.
Great. Can you hear me? It's not that big a room. Maybe I don't even need this. I don't know how long the remarks I have prepared will go for. So we'll see as we move along. If it's taking too much time, I will abbreviate. But anyway, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you today. It's always a delight to be in Boston. I spent many years here quite some time ago, and it's always interesting to attend a conference such as this on this topic. I'd like to speak, in fact, on U.S.-China relationship with a word about Russia and the security and the prosperity of Asia and perhaps the world beyond, because both are in significant peril. We stand today at a rather momentous point in history. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, America's role as the unambiguous leader and dominant power across maritime Asia and much of the globe is in doubt. Long-standing assumptions about the capacity and will of the United States to provide common security and sustain the foundations of global prosperity are being challenged by a rapid and significant diffusion of wealth and influence beyond the West. Within this process, most notably, the rise of China is drawing the most attention for obvious reasons. It's important, I think, at this critical moment to accurately grasp the nature of the challenge this shift in power represents to the United States, and especially the nature of China's challenge and America's response to that challenge. For both nations are becoming caught up in a simplistic zero-sum narrative that sounds convincing to many who know little about the mindset and motives of either country, but actually are serving to propel us towards what I see as unnecessary confrontation. Listening to the Trump administration, the key geostrategic issue facing the world today sounds very simple and very straightforward. It consists of a growing contest of largely existential proportions between three major revisionist powers, China, Russia, and Iran on one side, and the West, led by the United States, on the other. The former three states allegedly seek to replace the supposedly long-standing post-World War II Western-led liberal international order, marked by what I regard as rather purist notions of democracy, free trade, and respect for international law, to replace this with a hostile, undemocratic, mercantilist, law-violating order that seeks to displace the West, subjugate others, and dominate the world. This is a nice, neat, Manichaean challenge, black and white, easy to understand, untrammeled by confusing details. To cope with this stupendous challenge, the US government proposes an equally nice, neat, and straightforward solution. A reinvigorated America that is secure at home, from lawless, terrorist-infiltrated hordes of illegal immigrants, and strong abroad via a decisive leadership focused on countering all those who would threaten the liberal international order or use it to cheat, hoodwink, or otherwise weaken the United States. To make America secure and strong, the Trump administration and their supporters propose or are doing, for example, the following: a largely punitive, my way or the highway, bilateral approach to most interstate economic disputes, relying on thoroughly suspect national security justifications for non-WTO compliant tariffs and other punitive actions that probably violate international law. Largely feckless attempts to drastically increase defense spending to stay well ahead of China and all other real or imagined foes, while ignoring major threats such as climate change. Lots of hair-raising speeches about the threats posed by immigrants and undemocratic nations, designed apparently to scare the US public into accepting the costs of Washington's policies. And the US public, in many ways, thus far has not entirely bought this argument. And then finally, the creation in Asia of a so-called free and open Indo-Pacific strategy centered on a putative alliance among the so-called Quad, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, which, despite the remarks of the Trump administration to the contrary, is indeed designed primarily to counter China. And yet, despite all these rather extreme measures, the Trumpists would have you believe that all they want from China is fairness, reciprocity, and respect for international law. But don't you believe it? In the case of China, at least, their free versus revisionist order perspective requires a major distortion of the nature of the global order and China's place in it, and a decisive weakening of the Chinese government, and ideally its replacement by one more compliant with the interests of the United States. This is the clear implication of both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy recently enunciated by the Trump administration. You should read those documents carefully. They're breathtaking in both their simplicity and their audacity. Since neither Russia nor Iran really pose the kind of existential threat that China allegedly does, Washington would likely settle, in their case, merely for the end of efforts to undermine American democracy, the acceptance of current NATO boundaries, and some undefined Iranian denuclearization. Now, against all this arm-waving and rhetoric, there stands, for lack of a better word, reality. Unfortunately, reality is not as neat and simple as the Trump administration would like you to think. In fact, the difficulty is that there are elements of truth scattered amongst all the cartoonish depictions and unmoored accusations that spew out of Washington these days in the direction of China in particular. China's rise is indeed in some ways challenging old power structures, old assumptions about the requirements for order and prosperity, and some old norms and principles. Specifically, China's national goals of wealth and power have in many ways caused Beijing to become more assertive in some ways that are very troubling, using its greater power and influence to strengthen domestic controls, assert its sovereignty claims in nearby areas, reduce America's freedom of action along China's maritime periphery, and often resort to underhanded measures to acquire advanced technologies and capital. This is, of course, troubling and challenging for the U.S. and for others. But in my view, these acts in no way amount to a China that is engaged in overthrowing the entire global order from which it has profited so much for the past 30-plus years, nor to replace the U.S. as the global hegemon, an incredibly expensive and onerous task. Beyond support for democracy and free trade, this order also includes the existing global financial system, the WMD non-proliferation order, a variety of regimes designed to fight non-traditional security threats such as terrorism, pandemics, and climate change, and other key foundations of global health, security, and prosperity. Neither the overthrow of this order nor China's displacement of the U.S. as the world's new hegemon is either advantageous or necessary for Beijing's security and prosperity, and neither could be attained in anything like a cost-effective manner under even the best of circumstances. In any event, China doesn't need to replace the U.S. when Washington is doing a fine job on its own in reducing its relative power and isolating itself in an increasingly multipolar and globalized world by failing to deal with major problems at home while picking fights with allies and friends. Keep in mind that China is a relative newcomer to the global order and comes from a recent history marked by great internal disarray, high levels of corruption and cheating, a hefty dose of resentment toward and admiration for foreigners, and huge amounts of national pride, both culturally and as a result of its enormous developmental strides since the early 80s. This complex mix of perceptions and motives is mentioned by me not to excuse Beijing's misdeeds, but simply to show that China is not subject to the nice, neat labeling of the Trump administration and its supporters, and that it is decidedly on a learning curve within the global order, still in some ways immature in dealing with the outside and, yes, overly paranoid, although Trump is currently giving Beijing much to be paranoid about. But China is learning from others as much or more than it's trying to teach others. And a sophisticated mix of positive and negative incentives can influence its views much more than by the current demonization effort that is underway in Washington. Let me say a word about Russia. From at least a U.S. perspective, Russia is truly, in my view, a secondary player in this regional and global U.S.-China strategic game. It is essentially a regional power bordering sensitive areas for the West in both Asia and Europe, and thus able to cause considerable anxiety by threatening or intimidating its neighbors, some of whom are NATO members, which makes the problem much worse than it might otherwise be. To some considerable extent, what I regard as NATO's reckless expansion up to Russia's borders contributed significantly to the problems with Moscow we see today. Nonetheless, Russia does not pose the kind of broadly region-wide and global challenge that China will continue to pose. It has little influence over the global economy, aside from its limited impact on oil prices. It is in many ways a failed state that manages to punch above its weight due to its location, its nuclear status, its oil production, its heavy involvement in the cyber world, and its arrogant and autocratic leader. It certainly cannot be ignored or cast aside as U.S. policy has appeared to do in the past. And this is especially true given its growing strategic alignment with China. But that alignment is being driven to a great extent by U.S. missteps in simultaneously alienating both Moscow and Beijing. Both countries have many reasons not to move in lockstep with one another. China has been less willing than Russia to directly confront the U.S. in multilateral fora, and less willing to use military force and direct intervention to advance its influence in critical areas, as Russia has done in Syria, Crimea, Georgia, and Ukraine. Russia is more willing to directly act to subvert Western democracies. And of course, much of the Sino-Russian defense technology relationship remains rather distant. Moreover, although Moscow and Beijing benefit from standing together against some specific U.S. policies that threaten their interests, they are fundamentally oriented toward different regions, with a regional Russia most focused on Europe and China on Asia. Where they overlap most is in Central Asia, where their interests compete arguably more than they align with one another. And Russia provides few assets to China in the global economic arena. Indeed, China has much more to offer many Central Asian nations than does Russia. One might argue that at least some smaller states could benefit from this increasingly dangerous, contentious great power competition. For example, by playing Beijing against Russia, or both against the US in, say, Central Asia. That could produce some limited benefits, but could also result in greater instability as and if great power relations become more sharply zero-sum. Smaller states could be pressured in overwhelming ways to take sides, or be subject to incursions or worse by one power determined to deny access by the others. All told, while Russia can still contribute to Beijing's military modernization drive, provide diplomatic and political cover for China in opposing certain U.S. interests and policies, and can coordinate policies in certain areas to limit U.S. influence, the two states do not constitute what I would regard as a serious, coordinated strategic alliance. And they most certainly don't represent a unified revisionist world order, posing an unprecedented existential threat to the West. When we step back from all this, we can see that the primary strategic challenges presented by the U.S. and China relationship and the one involving Russia are twofold. One is a polarization of global politics and power perceptions that undermines the ability and willingness of all three nations, or in many cases, at least the US and China, from cooperating in handling common and growing global challenges, from climate change to the global economic order, nuclear stability and arms control, and major hotspots like Korea. Second, and closely related, the impact is an accompanying increase in the likelihood of state-to-state political military crises in those regions where at least two of these powers are deeply engaged, most notably in Central Europe and in East Asia. In the latter, about which I know much more, the evolution of the economic military power structure in the maritime realm from a US-Japan-centric one to an unstable China, US, Japan balance of power will make the occurrence of future crises there, in my opinion, more likely. And this is made even more the case by the failure of both sides to develop greater understandings on key volatile issues in the region, such as Taiwan, maritime disputes, and Korea. Indeed, in the absence of serious and sustained efforts to moderate the current ugly dynamic that exists between the US and China today, the chances of a significant crisis are arguably increasing. This could take many forms. Beijing could decide that what it regards as aggressive US containment and pushback efforts justify unprecedented displays of Chinese resolve and determination in the form, for example, of the permanent deployment of military forces on its artificial islands in the Spratlys, the South China Sea, and the declaration of a corresponding air defense identification zone, as the Chinese have declared in the East China Sea. For its part, Washington could decide that it needs to augment radically its deterrence capacities regarding Taiwan by, for example, allowing U.S. warships to visit the island on a regular basis. Worse, it could take steps to block improvements in cross-strait relations so as to ensure that a now, quote-unquote, strategically valuable Taiwan remains separate from mainland China. This would be a direct violation of Washington's long-standing one China policy that has ensured peace with Beijing for over 40 years. For some misguided proponents of a supposedly more realistic adversarial Sino-US relationship, such crises would presumably serve a positive function by strengthening public and elite determination to push back against the other side. In the US, such individuals seem to believe that only the threat or actual implementation of a complete disengagement and containment effort against Beijing can generate the resources and strength of will necessary to prevent China from dominating the West and destroying the global order. Some advocates of this reckless and ill-conceived approach insist that its positive results will prevent the emergence of a new Cold War environment by forcing Beijing to back down. In truth, such an approach would almost inevitably produce a new Cold War, especially if US-Russia relations continue to worsen and Sino-Russian relations continue to improve. And such an environment would prove far more destructive than beneficial for all the nations concerned. After all, US and Chinese interests today are more compatible, more intertwined, and the fortunes in the future equally so than was ever the case during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. The huge potential risks and dangers inherent in the current situation are compounded by the fact that the United States today is more insecure, less confident, more internally divided, more economically weak, and more dependent on the world now than it was during the height of the Cold War. As a result, in a new Cold War, a stronger China would be more likely to overestimate its ability to outmaneuver and pressure the United States. By the same token, a more insecure yet still very strong Washington would prove more susceptible to overreaction than it was in the face of Soviet Cold War threats. Taken together, these factors indicate that efforts by either or both sides to isolate or undermine the other in the spirit of the Cold War of the 50s and early 60s will produce major dangers for both countries and others. For that reason, many other capitals would resist attempts by Washington and Beijing to compel them to choose sides in a zero-sum struggle for dominance. The resulting disruption would severely undermine the world economy, cripple global and regional cooperation on many issues, and impel some nations to devote more resources to military defense instead of economic development. The net result of all this would be the increased likelihood of instability and crisis within nations, regions, and ultimately across the globe. So what's the path back to a more realistic, productive relationship? The US relationship with China, and I dare say with Russia, will be more contentious and intensively competitive for the foreseeable future than it has been at any time in recent memory, regardless of who leads what country. That said, more intensely competitive interactions do not necessarily mean a sharply confrontational, zero-sum relationship of the kind now apparently favored by the Trump administration and perhaps advocated by some in China. There is an alternative to the emergence of what would amount to a new, extremely destructive Cold War. The challenge for all sides, and especially the US and China, is to develop a bilateral relationship that more realistically addresses the genuine as opposed to the imaginary or exaggerated concerns of the other side, while recognizing the very real common reasons to cooperate effectively where needed. Despite the current downward spiral, incentives exist in Washington, Beijing, and other capitals to fashion what amounts to a middle path that rejects the self-destructive, worst-case assumptions increasingly evident today and the unrealistic belief that the relationship can somehow return to the more easily managed, cooperative dynamics of the past. While a serious crisis management dialogue and frank, constructive efforts to identify the possible middle ground on specific policy areas of contention can go a long way to placing the U.S.-China relationship on less volatile, more productive footing. A more fundamental course correction is necessary for the long term. The U.S.-China relationship needs to develop a new strategic narrative, one based on a realistic and feasible set of facts and assumptions about the changing capabilities, actions, and intentions of both sides. This is particularly needed in the Asia-Pacific, where the sources of serious crisis or even conflict are most present. As I've written in a Carnegie report of a few years back entitled Creating a Stable Asia, an Agenda for a U.S.-China Balance of Power, Beijing and Washington must eventually recognize that neither power will dominate the Asia-Pacific in the future. The near inevitable balance of power that will most likely emerge, that in fact is emerging, must be made more stable to avoid the most serious outcomes I've already discussed. This can only happen on the basis of a common appreciation of the huge benefits that will accrue to both countries from three things: from the cultivation of a single integrated Asian economic system rather than a set of mutually exclusive and competing subsystems, from an effective crisis avoidance and crisis management structure and diplomatic and military understandings regarding the region's most volatile hotspots, and third, from a more defense-oriented, less escalatory set of common force postures and military doctrines, what people describe as denial doctrines as opposed to offensive war-winning doctrines. And we can discuss that if you wish later. The strategic logic of such a stable, mutually beneficial balance of power will derive from the two nations' common need to continue receiving the obvious rewards that the Asia-Pacific region offers. A steadily worsening relationship would obviously inevitably put these benefits at risk. A more stable Asia, much less a more stable overall Sino-US relationship, will not develop overnight. This transformation can only take place over a period of years, under the direction of experienced diplomats, business leaders, and military officers who possess a strong sense of the high stakes involved and a clear understanding of the dangers of allowing the corrosive status quo to continue. This will likely require new leadership in the US and possibly in China and Russia as well. And this new leadership will need to develop a different conception of great power competition in the 21st century. Narrow, chauvinistic protectionism will impoverish all who utilize it in an unavoidably globalized world. And great power spheres of influence and notions of domination or hegemonic stability, as it's called in political science, will need to give way to more deliberate balances, along with regional and global economic arrangements that more accurately reflect the complexities of a new integrated economy and a new integrated order, especially in the areas of technology development, services, and in the cyber world. The result will not be a return to the past model of relations, but rather a set of interactions that is more competitive, more equally balanced, and yet still in many ways cooperative and mutually beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swaine. I thought we could first, start off our little conversation with the kind of changes in doctrines that you were talking about right towards the end. What did you exactly mean by that?
Well, there's something called a denial strategy, which is basically that rather than having countries believe that they must acquire the capacity to control certain vital areas and then take the conflict to the enemy by destroying his rear areas, by destroying his command and control, etc. The alternative is to put in place a set of capabilities that are more oriented for each side to deny total control over a particular area. Let's say the first island chain, which is the geographic area that goes from roughly Korea to Japan to Taiwan down to the Philippines. and Southeast Asia. In that area, neither side has dominance. Both sides have largely defensive-oriented military systems in place, and they rely more on long-range ballistic missile, submarine, and other sorts of hardening effects for emplacements along the Asian littoral, rather than more offensive aircraft and aircraft carriers forward deployed and other surface combatants that would be forward deployed. There's been a lot written about this alternative force posture. Somebody who's written about it most recently is probably Eric Hegenbotham, who was at the RAND Corporation. And he and some others wrote a recent report called I think it's called the China Scorecard, or the Military Scorecard, where they look at the military posture of the United States, China, and US allies in Asia. And they make an argument about the need to transition to this more denial or defensive-oriented force posture. It would require, in some respects, a strengthening of the US-Japan alliance, not a weakening of the alliance. But it would do so within certain very clear parameters. Japan's ability to defend its airfields, to defend its key strategic assets would be increased. You'd need more ballistic missile defense, you'd need more hardening, and it also would rely to some degree on a greater diffusion of US capabilities, as I say, not necessarily forward deployed, but further back in Guam and even in Hawaii or CONUS. But it is not, in my view, impractical strategy, and it's one that I think would provide a greater level of reassurance to both sides, and would also, in some ways, reduce the tendency to escalate rapidly in a crisis to try and achieve what's called escalation dominance. I think that capacity is going to be in doubt by either side in the next 10 to 15 years in the Western Pacific. So the question is, how do you transition to something that's an alternative that does not have that kind of preemptive action, quick strike, quick response kind of a posture? And that's what this denial posture is supposed to address.
I just one more question before we can open up the discussion to the floor. You talked a lot about needing platforms for serious, sustained dialogue, and I think you were talking a lot about one comprehensive Asian economic system, a crisis management structure. My personal question is, there's a lot of discussion about how difficult it is to institutionalize in Asia, to build institutions that last and are strong enough to accommodate different interests. What would you have to say towards that?
It's not an easy challenge by any means. What I'm proposing, what I've been proposing, is not something that would be easy to implement for a whole host of reasons. Partly it goes against the assumptions that many people have about what provides for order and prosperity in Asia. I think most American decision makers still believe that what they regard as American primacy or American freedom of action, or however you want to describe it, but it amounted to maritime predominance in the military sphere with very strong economic presence across the region. I think most American decision makers still believe that the United States can sustain that and can stay, in effect, well ahead of China, even in Asia, by spending more on defense, by increasing the capacity of the U.S. economy, although there is not much support to do that by government means, and that will work. My argument is that I don't think that will work. I think it will just deepen the problem. I don't think the United States will be able to stay well ahead of China, certainly not in terms of perceptions within the region of relative influence. China will be deploying much more significant and larger numbers of different types of military systems. And it will be involving itself more deeply economically in the activities of the region in terms of investment. Already it's the dominant trader. It's not the dominant investor, but I think that's going to change over time. And so many other countries in the region will look at this as a shifting situation, which it is, and that will affect their own calculations about what they need to do. in order to preserve their relative freedom of action. Now, the second thing that I would say is that what I'm advocating is not a grand bargain, which is what some people have said. I'm not advocating that the United States and China need to sit down around a table and carve out Asia and decide who gets what and what we're going to do here and there. This is not something that can be done through some kind of across-the-table agreement. It's a process, but it's a process that's based upon a certain set of assumptions and beliefs about where you want to end up. And if you believe you can end up with a stable balance that can be sustained over time, and that the different trajectories of economic growth and political, social evolution are moving us in that direction, whether we like it or not, then I think you've gone a certain way towards beginning a dialogue. But the first thing that has to happen is there has to be more dialogue within the United States and within China, and there has to be more dialogue between the United States and its allies, because nothing the United States does in Asia vis-a-vis the Chinese or anybody else in the security realm is going to be done against the wishes of or ignoring the interests of America's allies. And first and foremost, there is Japan. Japan today, interestingly enough, if you look at Abe's policy moves, he's had a rough period with China about 8 years ago. Today, it's much better. And Abe's position, I sense, as I go to Japan and talk to people and others, that not just Abe's, but other Japanese positions are also beginning to shift slightly. And in what direction are they shifting? They're beginning to shift to hedge against a growing Sino-American zero-sum competition, because the Japanese recognize that they can't move themselves further from China, and their economic entanglement with China is deeply intertwined, and they cannot divorce themselves from China. So they have to transition to a position where there is a greater ability on their part to be able to hedge against a more extreme position in the US-China relationship. And I think that's what, in some regards, they're trying to do now. So anything the United States does in terms of implementing this kind of set of approaches I'm talking about would have to be done with the concurrence and the support of Japan. Korea is a more complex question, and we can get into that if you'd like to discuss it, but my basic take on the Korea situation is that ultimately we're going to have to be transitioning to something that looks like a unified Korea that is much less formally aligned with the United States. It still has a close relationship with the United States, but no longer has US forces on the Korean Peninsula, but has good relations with both China and with the United States. We're not anywhere near that at this point. The bigger problem right now is dealing with North Korea's nuclear weapons. And handling that problem, though, and handling the long-term issue of the future of the Korean Peninsula is, in my view, somewhat related. You can't get to a denuclearized Korean Peninsula and a more stable environment in Northeast Asia without getting to some greater understanding about what the future of Korea looks like from the point of view of both the Chinese, the Americans, and the Koreans and the Japanese, and that's not an easy thing to achieve. So what I'm saying in my long-winded answer to your question is that I acknowledge this is not an easy kind of an approach. Many people will settle for confidence-building measures and what people call muddling through. You just muddle through. You take the issues as they come, you try and manage them, you stave off the worst case, and you just keep going. My concern is that we are already approaching a period where that kind of an approach is going to become increasingly counterproductive, because the kinds of assumptions that are being made in Washington today about China and the kinds of reassessments that are beginning now in China about the United States are going to close off the ability to muddle through on this problem, in my view.
Thank you, Dr. Swaine. I'd like to open the time now to any questions from the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Swaine, for your great presentation. My name is Thomas Bernard. I work at the Fletcher School.
It's a good question. I give the impression, I know in my remarks, that I'm sort of dumping everything on the Trump administration. It's pretty bad, but it reflects a larger shift. And this is something that I and many other sinologists have been telling the Chinese for quite some time, because the Chinese look at the situation in the United States today and they're concerned about it, they're perplexed about it, but they're not quite yet sure how durable this shift is. In part, they listen to President Trump and they hear his happy talk about his great relations with Xi Jinping and how we just need to have a great trade deal and everything's going to be hunky-dory. And then they read the national security strategy, national defense strategy, listen to John Bolton, and they listen to others in the administration lower down, and they get a very different picture. I personally think that President Trump himself doesn't realize or know much about what's going on in China policy beyond his more focused concern, which is trade and the Korea issue when it comes up. I think others are more engaged in moving U.S. policy in the kind of directions I've described. Now, that said, I think that direction is exaggerated in the Trump administration. That is to say, the kind of reassessment of China, I think, is bipartisan. It goes across party lines in the United States. There is a fundamental view now that the past American policy of engagement with China has been too lax, has allowed China to basically get away with murder in a variety of different areas, and that the United States, as a result of that, needs to push back, as the common parlance has it. It has to be able to show China that it's not going to be business as usual anymore. And so it has to confront it on those areas where it thinks it's most in violation of, where the U.S. thinks it's most in violation of international law or what have you. I think that sentiment is, as I said, bipartisan. I don't think it necessarily is as extreme and as apparently rigid as those below President Trump would like it to be. And so I think there is room in the U.S. body politic for a more sensible U.S.-China policy that is still very competitive, but is not nearly as zero-sum and not nearly as antagonistic as the current Trump administration policy is in a variety of different areas.
Okay.
Does she have to use the mic for questions?
Yeah. I was just.
Somebody give her.
I got it. I got it.
So somebody needs to give her a mic if you want a mic used.
Sorry, do you see a counterpart movement inside China, too, that's feeling like they have to deal with the United States sooner rather than later? There was a People's Daily editorial last fall that talked about how the United States, every time some power gets to 60% of U.S. GDP, the U.S. has to smack them down. There's the constant Global Times and some others in Chinese who are talking about this. What do you see as China's strategy and how that's changing?
I think the Chinese, some years ago, the Chinese went through a process of internal debate over the basic programmatic guideline or the era in which China was operating. And some of you probably know this. China made the decision at the beginning of the reform period that it was in a period of long-term peace and development. I mean, they call it that, peace and development. And they were in a period of what they call a strategic opportunity. And by that, what is meant, I mean, everybody puts a very sinister tone to that, but what they meant by that was the prospects for global war were low. The opportunities for China to focus on its economic development and not focus on dealing with possible conflicts with others was high. So military modernization was put last in the four developments for many, many years. So you've got a China, though, that today still talks about this being a period of strategic opportunity. They have not yet redefined this period as one of peace and development. And these labels actually matter within the Chinese system. But what you have had is you've had a growing amount of debate based upon interactions that I've had and others have had with many Chinese scholars, officials, and others. And the debate tends to, according to some, tends to fall into three different general categories. And you can imagine what they are. There's a hardline version, there's a softline version, and then there's a kind of a mainstream version. The hardline version is, well, look and see what the United States is doing now. What have we told you all along? The United States is fundamentally a hegemonic power. It will not in any way give its influence over to China, even on China's doorstep in the Western Pacific. The only way to deal with this is to become much more assertive in our own rights, strengthen our own capabilities, and become much more bottom line in dealing with the United States and with more red lines, et cetera. So we need to push back harder. So it's a pushback against the pushback, with a confirmation that we've told you this all along. The United States has always wanted to contain China, and that's what it's trying to do now, with much greater enthusiasm. The opposite side of that is that the United States is doing these things that are threatening to China, but on the one hand, China can't reverse its course from its commitment to the international system. It is integrated in the global economy and has to continue to deepen that integration. What is obstructing that is a combination of U.S. reaction to some of the things that China has done imprudently in provoking the United States, and also it's a reaction to what's going on domestically within China. China is becoming more ideological. China is becoming more controlling domestically for a variety of reasons, and this is fueling further views in the West about China's objectives, its motives. The argument in China, the softline argument, is that these things, it's really a criticism in part of the Xi Jinping regime. These things are taking us down the wrong path. We're going in the wrong direction here. We're doing too many things now that are going to not just excite the United States, but they're also going to stand in the way of our developing greater reforms, economic reforms, and for some political reforms. And so the idea is we need to be more reflective. We, the Chinese, need to be more reflective about our own contribution to this problem, and we need to be more critical in some ways of what Xi Jinping himself is doing within China. That's kind of the soft line view, and there are variations of it. Needless to say, it's not exactly the leadership view. It's not exactly the dominant view. The mainstream view, as I see it, is basically, at this point in time, the Xi Jinping view. And the Xi Jinping view is, he doesn't want to fight with the United States. He doesn't want a growing confrontation with the United States. He thinks the United States can be kept at bay by negotiations, given China's growing influence in the economic system, the global economic system, and its contacts with other countries, which are interacting with China a lot in the Belt and Road Initiative, in the European Union, in Southeast Asia. China right now has actually improved its relationships with many, many, many of these areas and many of these countries. And it's doing that very deliberately as a way of hedging against what the United States is doing. And I think this comes from, Xi Jinping supports this, no question. So he doesn't want to fight. He thinks that there can be a middle ground here, I think, in various ways. But at the same time, domestically, what Xi Jinping is doing is he is reacting to the current domestic situation in China in a very, what I would call a very Leninist way. He is seeking to purify the party, to rid it of corrupt elements as much as he can, to strengthen his own personal position of power, because that is essentially the ultimate guarantee of order. And he's trying to increase the support of the Chinese people, of the party, and of its views. I think that's a losing strategy for China over time. I think China was on a better flight path some years ago, but the problem is Xi Jinping is not doing all these things just because he loves power or he's power hungry. I think he's doing these things and is supported in doing these things by many people within the Chinese leadership because he feels they're necessary to keep stability in China as they continue to expand and develop economically, which inevitably means more and more interaction with the outside world. So reform has been successful in many respects, but reform has also produced enormous problems within China in terms of political order and stability that the party has no alternative to beyond itself. And so you have to be able to create a more capable, less corrupt party and a clearer vision of the future, rejuvenation of China, than you've had before. Under Hu Jintao, it was unclear, a little unclear and wavering, and too much involved in just going out and getting rich. Now you need more discipline in order to be able to sustain stability as we move to an even more tumultuous kind of future. I think that's the kind of logic that Xi Jinping has in his head. But the method for doing that, of course, as I say, falls back on methods that I think are in the 21st century going to prove to be counterproductive for China.
If you have time for one more question.
Hi, Michael. Good to see you here. Yeah, I have a question regarding the new situation report of the Department of Defense, which was published in January on suggesting a whole of government opposition or against China. Actually, I see some of this, their tones corresponds to your argument that currently we can no longer still keep this muddling through a method, but we need to assert ourselves, etc. So, but this report looks more like a very hawkish view. But however, it claims to be a bipartisan result. So I would like to hear your analysis on what's the implication of such kind of report, which is although very hawkish, but actually saying that suggesting a whole of government, a comprehensive method.
Yeah, I mean, this is just the latest example of, I mean, there's many you can cite of documents that are being put out now by the US government that adopt this kind of categorical, absolutist sort of interpretation of the threat that China poses and the way in which we go about dealing with that threat. I mean, this whole of society approach parrots, I think, what FBI Director Wray said in his statement about the threat that China poses to American society. And this gets at the issue of Chinese influence activities in the United States. And this, in turn, reflects the controversy that has gone on in Australia over some Chinese influence activities of politicians and businessmen in Australia. So this has led to what I regard as an incredible overreaction within the United States about exactly what kind of concerns China poses to American society. In some ways, it's reminiscent of the 1950s in the United States. We're getting that kind of if any of you remember, in the 1950s was a period where we had somebody named Joseph McCarthy, who was a member of Congress, who believed that communists were hiding under every bush in the United States, and he actually had real power in the government at that time. That's not to say that there are influence activities that China conducts vis-a-vis Taiwan, and in some respects in the United States that aren't of some concern. But the idea that there is this vast, extensive, coordinated, intrusive, deeply intrusive Chinese effort to undermine American society, et cetera, people have yet to give me evidence of this. I have yet to see this in serious evidence that justifies that level of concern. I think that in part, the level of anxiety that exists in Washington is in part a reflection of the level of insecurity that exists in Washington about the future, about the certainty of the United States and its role in the world. All of these issues are now under much greater discussion. And that's good. It should be discussed more. That's what a democratic society is all about. I wish there were more discussions like that in China. And of course there are not. Any kind of discussions about the future of China is very rigidly controlled by the party. And that ultimately is not going to be helpful in my view. So I don't see these all of society slogans as being at all helpful. I think they lead. I mean, some of you have seen the reaction of the Committee of 100, which is of 100 very influential Chinese Americans who are deeply concerned about this and where it's going in the United States. And I'm concerned about it as well. There are some people in the Congress who are using it as a kind of political hobby horse to advance their own interests, because there isn't much downside in bashing China. However, there is a silver lining in this. As I read the polls, and in talking to people outside of Washington, there is not nearly the same kind of alarm and concern and focus about China outside of Washington as there is in Washington. There is a greater recognition among most Americans that China and the United States are very heavily involved economically. There is a recognition that in many ways the U.S.-China trade benefits their locality, their state, their city, etc. Local politicians are still very cognizant of the benefits that they get from interacting with China. Somebody I know, a good friend who just came to Washington to take a position at Carnegie, has been living in Chicago for years. And he's been interacting with people outside of Chicago in the Midwest and others. And he says it's just astounding to him, the contrast in the general perceptions and attitudes that you're getting outside of Washington and within Washington. I don't want to overplay this. Polls have shown that Americans are concerned about the economic challenge that China poses. Some Americans believe that in 20 years, China will be the dominant economic power and greatly overshadow the United States. I think that is unlikely. However, you have that concern on the part of Americans, yet at the same time, you don't have this sense through the polling that there's this growing wave of concern about China as a kind of existential threat, a security threat to the United States that you see reflected in things like the national security strategy and national defense strategy. Most Americans just aren't buying that. They don't see exactly what it is that the United States and China are going to go to war over. What is the nature of that existential threat? And I think that that is a good thing, because I think there's a lot of common sense that's going on there. And I think that things like, unfortunately, Vice President Pence's speech, which some of you may have read of last month or a couple of months ago at the Hudson Institute, where all of these Trump administration hardline policies were just basically put into one. And Pence I was told, did not like giving that speech. He didn't want to be the front person for this, but he was told to do it. And I think it was directed at the American people. I think it was primarily directed at the American people to get them more concerned about China than they are right now. Don't get me wrong, there are issues over which the United States and China have some very fundamental differences, and they have to be dealt with. But they are not going to get dealt with in this kind of zero-sum, winner-take-all, totalistic kind of approach that we're seeing now in Washington, and which in some parts in China is now being advocated for.
Thank you, Dr. Swaine. We've come to the end of the David Rawson Memorial Lecture. Dr. Swaine will obviously be joining us for the Maritime panel that's slated to start in about 15 minutes. So between now and then, might be a good time for a bathroom break if you need one, or we can have just some kind of interaction before we start the Maritime panel at 2:15. Thank you very much, everyone.